Tipping points and feedback loops are the reason we're in a climate emergency. We will be breaching ecological thresholds soon, and we only have 5 years to turn away from that fate. If we cross these tipping points that I'll try to explain as succinctly as I can, it won't matter if we shut off every carbon emitting device, from cars to buildings, shut down overnight. The collapse of an ecosystem is inevitable once a tipping point is crossed. Consequently, global temperatures and sea level rise could be impossible to stop because each tipping point we cross can catapult us to the next one. If we don't act with collective urgency to avoid upcoming tipping points, the future of humanity will suffer unimaginable consequences for our actions, and they'll blame us for not doing something while we could. Addressing counterpoints like what about China and carbon footprints will have to be saved for another video, so please listen to this with an open mind without dismissing this with pre-established beliefs. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, tipping points are a critical threshold in a system that, when exceeded, can lead to a significant change in the state of the system, often with an understanding that that change is irreversible. Ecosystems like rainforests or tundra thrive within a range of conditions, just like our bodies require a range of temperature. Tipping points are the thresholds of those environmental ranges. Breaching a tipping point will cause an ecosystem to inevitably collapse, like bankruptcy, first slowly, then quickly. And most ecosystems will release a massive amount of greenhouse gas when they collapse, which can push us over other tipping points. For example, permafrost is the subsurface layer of soil that remains frozen throughout the year, and we are close to breaching temperatures in the Arctic region that would cause all permafrost to inevitably melt. The collapse of this system will emit enough carbon and methane to push us over other nearby tipping points. PBS Terra does a much better job at explaining this, as they are one of the best educational sources on climate change.
Really quickly, permafrost is land that's frozen year-round, and has been for a long time. Global warming is gradually thawing this permafrost, releasing even more carbon into the atmosphere, leading to more warming and more thaw. And I think you can see the problem here. We're talking about hundreds of billions of tons of carbon dioxide and methane that could be released from the permafrost, which would add measurably to global warming. The thaw is almost contagious and spreads quickly, creating lots of smaller local tipping points. And lakes like this are important for two big reasons. One is that they convey heat to the surrounding permafrost, leading to the spread of further thaw and the creation of more lakes. And two, when organic matter breaks down underwater, which is what happened here, it creates methane, and methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas.
But you have to realize 50 years ago, this was all a permafrost plateau that's now transitioning into a lake. And so what you'll find is a lot of methane, extreme methane emissions here, but none here.
When we look down from space, we see that we're crossing quite a few permafrost tipping points locally, and they are visible as these craters or pot marks. So the big concern is that we see those tipping points escalating and it becoming a much larger scale problem, an amplifier of climate change.
Climate scientists say that the permafrost melt tipping point is 1.5 degrees, and we just breached that. So we are right on the edge of this ecosystem's tipping point. 2024 was the first calendar year that we breached the 1.5 degree target that was set at the Paris Agreement. They chose that number for a few reasons. One, because it seemed like it was possible, and we blew past it way before we thought we could, and because 1.5 degrees triggers some tipping points. This domino effect of breaching tipping points would cause runaway, unstoppable global warming. One tipping point we've already crossed is the West Antarctic ice sheet, which contains the Thwaites Glacier, aka the Doomsday Glacier. So that's not good, and this could raise sea levels by 15 to 30 feet. But the collapse of this system and any of these systems doesn't happen overnight. That's what makes climate change so difficult to understand It's the time that it takes. Global warming is like an oven preheating, and it's going to take time for our atmosphere to catch up to what we've already emitted. And once ecosystems start gradually collapsing, there's nothing that we can do to save them.
With melting ice from the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets, Tim says we're already committed to 10 meters of sea level rise, which will essentially redraw the coastlines of the world and displace about 1 billion people.
So it doesn't matter if we make drastic changes in limiting our emissions now, the West Antarctic ice sheet will inevitably collapse. Now, the melting of ice causes a feedback loop called the albedo effect. The disappearing ice leaves less white surfaces for sunlight to reflect off of and more dark ocean to absorb the sunlight. So the more ice melts, the hotter it gets, the more ice melts. Another feedback loop is wildfires. The 2020 wildfire season in just California released twice as much CO2 emissions as the cars in the UK did that year. Emissions from wildfires heat up the planet, causing more wildfires. Feedback loop. As we're pushed over tipping points by feedback loops and humans continue to emit greenhouse gases that we know raise global temperatures, we trigger other tipping points, creating runaway, unstoppable ecosystem collapses. Let me describe how all of these tipping points have a domino effect on other tipping points. The Greenland ice sheet won't be too far behind the West Antarctic ice sheet, and as fresh water pours into the Atlantic from glacial melt, the ocean water density that powers deep convection of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation will be disrupted and will cause that system to collapse. Remember the AMOC in the movie The Day After Tomorrow? Yeah, that circulation can collapse soon.
Some calculations show that the AMOC has already weakened by around 15% in the last 50 years. And scientists fear it could eventually slow to a halt, which would have extreme impacts on global climate as a whole.
But the collapse of the AMOC won't cause the conditions that Jake Gyllenhaal had to fight against. Instead, it will cause tropical monsoon systems to collapse.
Well, that means disrupting monsoon systems around the tropics, kind of near the Atlantic in West Africa on one side and South America, the Amazon region on the other, but also around the planet in India.
Farmers around the world count on these reliable rain cycles each year. Changing their timing, location, or strength would disrupt the livelihoods of over 1 billion people and complicate global food supplies as agriculture has to relocate and productivity is decreased. This could cause a large climate migration and weaken the food supply of over 1 billion people.
When the tropical monsoon seasons collapse, the Amazon rainforest will follow.
Disrupting the rainfall regime and the monsoon over northern South America could be a big risk factor for the Amazon rainforest, which is definitely at risk of already observed increasing length and severity of the dry season.
Rainforest dieback will turn the lungs of the earth into a savanna, which will emit massive amounts of greenhouse gases in the process.
So if this monsoon disruption amounts to further intensification of the dry season, that's the thing that could risk a more widespread dieback of the Amazon forest that then becomes self-propelling because the Amazon recycles its own rainfall back to the atmosphere. You take the trees away and you reduce the recycling, that tends to take more trees away, and so on and so forth.
But before all of those ecosystems are threatened, our coral reefs are the canary in the coal mine, and they don't have much longer left. When ocean waters breach a certain temperature, coral reefs die off quickly in an event called coral bleaching. Thankfully, coral reefs dying don't release massive amounts of greenhouse gases that trigger other tipping points, but 1/4 of ocean life is sustained by coral reefs. They are the most biologically diverse areas on the planet, and they're disappearing quickly. Not to mention, local economies rely on the health of coral life. These gems of the earth are the first to go in this era of global warming. They'll soon be gone if we don't intervene.
This morning, scientists say the 101.1 degree temperature recorded at a buoy near Key Largo, Florida this week may break a record for the highest observed sea surface temperature.
But what's unique about this summer, in my experience, which is now 30 years I've been working on this, I have not seen a particular summer that is this glaringly hot everywhere.
Warming in the ocean tends to find its way out through stronger hurricanes, changes in ocean patterns, coral bleaching, loss of sea ice in the Arctic region. It's all connected.
For much of the last 10,000 years, our planet's climate has been remarkably stable in three important ways: temperature, atmospheric carbon dioxide, and sea level. During this time, the human population went from 20 million people on Earth to 8 billion. That stable climate period is what allowed the development of human civilization as we know it. But that stability is gone, and the impacts aren't linear. That's because of tipping points.
Looking at climate change through the lens of ecosystem collapse may have obscured the real-world impacts of human life and societies, but a future with runaway climate change looks like billions of climate refugees, famines, novel disease, megastorms, fires and floods that decimate cities beyond repair, and wars over resources like water, all of which amounting to the likely collapse of the entire global economy. There are experts that say that we're already doomed because they believe the tipping point for ice has already been crossed, and when ice goes, the rest is inevitable. The latest IPCC report stated that we need to cut global emissions in half by 2030 in just 5 years, and we're nowhere near that goal. We need a massive economic mobilization akin to the New Deal if we were to reach that goal of cutting emissions in half by 2030. But unfortunately, the US will not be taking lead on this necessary effort because for the next 4 years, we're going to be led by a climate denier that the fossil fuel industry gave a lot of money to. And he's putting people like Lee Zeldin and Chris Wright in powerful positions that will make choices that will accelerate this climate crisis in the last remaining years we have to avoid these upcoming tipping points. Which means it is necessary that we collectively act to avoid these tipping points, which will cause inevitable suffering for our children and future generations. The severity of this crisis often evades our mainstream media because it goes against their sponsors' interests and because it gets low ratings, because it's stressful and it's abstract. However, all is not lost. I'm a fan of fictional storytelling, and most stories have a moment where all seems lost. The odds are against the protagonist and they're forced to rise to the challenge. This is that moment for humanity. We are the last humans able to steer the ship away from the iceberg. We are literally the most powerful humans to ever exist because what we do now will impact generations to come. This is a moment of profound consequence, so now is the time to rally the troops. We need more people to understand the urgency of the situation and start participating in nonviolent direct action. Like protests, marches, boycotts, blockades, strikes, and sit-ins. Sustained pressure on a large scale that disrupts this capitalist system is the mass movement that is necessary in order to win a green energy revolution by and for the people. This movement requires more people to understand the urgency of climate change and for many of them to join an environmental justice organization. I'm often disheartened to see how divided we are ideologically. We often identify the same problems but have opposing solutions. Thankfully, the best way to defeat in-group versus out-group bias is to solve a problem together, and climate change will affect everyone. There's nothing more galvanizing than this issue, and to solve it, we need to confront and dismantle capitalist systems that put us into this situation. We don't have to agree on everything, but we must collectively agree to decarbonize our energy systems. We do have solutions like an energy transition outlined by Project Drawdown, but that topic deserves its own video too. Hopefully this video helped people that may be dismissive of ideas like the Green New Deal be more inquisitive of possible solutions because they now better understand the gravity of the crisis. Thankfully, humans are intertwined just like ecosystems are interconnected. And like ecosystems, we have feedback loops and tipping points. A feedback loop like when people see climate activists or student protesters being mistreated by police, more people turn out for the cause the next day. Another human tipping point that we have is when 3.5% of the population sustains in protest. That puts enough pressure on the levies of power to enact change. Fossil fuel company tipping points are when they are no longer profitable because they've either lost in court so much and are being held accountable for their externalities like pollution and climate-fueled disasters. No one should be profiting off the destruction of our ecosystems. So this is it. This is our last chance to not doom our descendants. We were sleepwalking towards a climate catastrophe cliff. Now Trump's administration has us sprinting towards it. A political and energy revolution needs to happen now before we condemn humanity. If you'd like to further educate yourself on climate tipping points, watch PBS Terra's videos linked in the comments. If you'd like to get involved in climate actions, message me and I can send you an environmental justice calendar for actions in Colorado. Thank you for listening, and please get involved in this movement.